week 14 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few defense DST units I would start this week. The first one, the Denver Broncos. So the Broncos, obviously a great matchup this week versus the Detroit Lions. That give up the 6 most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And the Broncos, they've been a middle of the pack type of defense this year for fantasy owners. Week 10 versus Philly in that one, 24 points allowed, a sack and an into. Week 12 versus the Chargers, 13 points allowed, 3 sacks, 2 windows, a touchdown. And week 13 at the Chiefs, 16 points allowed only, but only a sack and an into. But right here versus Jared Goff and the Lions, I think this defense could have a good game. And let's be honest, this Denver Bronco defense plays way better at home than they do on the road. And right now they're available as well still in 52% of fantasy leagues. So they're definitely a defense I would start this week. The next one's the Seattle Seahawks. So the Seahawks here, a 1 week start with a great matchup at the Houston Texans that give up the second most fantasy points to defenses here. So the last few weeks for the Seahawks, week 11 versus Arizona, 23 points, 2 sacks in that one. Week 12 at Washington, 17 points allowed, a sack and into, block kick in that one, and a return punt and a return extra point. And then week 13 versus San Francisco, 23 points allowed, 2 windows, a fumble recovery in that one, and a fake punt touchdown in that game. So Seattle here, the last 2 games have actually been pretty decent for fantasy owners. And this week here in week 14 at Houston, I think they could score 8 to 10 fantasy points, and they're available widely right now in 85% of fantasy leagues. The next defense is the Green Bay Packers. So the Packers here, they've been one of the better units all season in fantasy football. But in my opinion, they're still under-owned and only 39%. And what a great matchup here in week 14 versus Chicago. That gives up the 7th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. I think the Packers in this one could have another big game. So the last few weeks for them, week 10 versus Seattle, they shut them out, 3 sacks, 2 interceptions. Week 11 in Minnesota, tough loss for them, 34 points allowed, 2 sacks. And then versus a great Ram offense, 28 points allowed, but 2 sacks and into, 2 fumble recoveries and a touchdown. So right here, I think in this one, if it's Dalton or Fields, they're going to tee you off either way here is this Green Bay defense. And their defense, that's got to be owned in more fantasy leagues. And their defense, that's going to be a top 3 defense in my opinion this week. And a definite start. The next defense is the Tennessee Titans. So the Titans, I know this team's been a Jekyll and Hyde team. 1 week, they look like the best team in the NFL. And then the next week, they can't beat the New York Jets or the Houston Texans. But anyway, the last few games here for Tennessee, week 10 versus New Orleans, 21 points allowed, 4 sacks, a fumble recovery. Week 11 versus Houston, 22 points allowed. And week 12 at New England, 36 points allowed, 2 sacks. So right here, they had the bye in week 13. Maybe they could get a little healthier here in week 14 versus Jacksonville. That gives up the 3rd most points to defenses on the season. And going back to early in the year versus Jacksonville, in week 5 out there, 19 points allowed, 2 sacks, an into, fumble recovery, and a touchdown. I think Tennessee could put up similar numbers. I don't know about the touchdown, but everything else I think lines up in this ball game. And their defense available in a great amount of leagues as well at 73%. And their defense I would start this week. And the 5th and final defense I look to start this week, the Carolina Panthers. So the Panthers here got a great matchup and the best matchup you possibly could have for a DST defense here versus the Atlanta Falcons that give up the most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And the Falcons here, they've been a train wreck offensively. Besides Cordell Patterson and Russell Gage, who's shown flashes on and off this year, no one has really done anything. We know Ridley's going to be out possibly for the season with his off-the-field issues here. And Julio Jones obviously traded in the offseason to Tennessee, so he's not coming back. But anyway, Matt Ryan got off to a good start early in the year. He hasn't looked the same. And I think the Panthers could exploit that once again this week in their Week 8 matchup at Atlanta. 13 points allowed for the Panther D, 3 sacks, 2 windows. Week 9 versus New England, 18 points allowed, 2 sacks and into, fumble recovery. Week 10 at Arizona, 10 points allowed, 4 sacks and into, fumble recovery. Week 11 versus Washington, 27 points allowed, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. And week 12 in Miami, 33 points allowed, 2 sacks, and a fumble recovery. So the last 2 weeks in the games this Panther team played obviously couldn't get the job done. Week 13 they had a bye, which was a good thing maybe for them to refresh, but with a great matchup in this week's game versus the Falcons, like I mentioned, who give up the most fantasy points. I think this Panther defense could have a good ball game, and they're available right now whopping 75% of fantasy leagues. So that's a few defense DST units I would start here for week 14 of the fantasy football season.